Dr. Caren Baruch-Feldman, who's a clinical psychologist and a certified school psychologist. She maintains a private practice in Scarsdale and works as a school psychologist in Harrison. She is author of the Grit Guide for Teens and co-author of the Resilience Workbook for Kids. Dr. Baruch-Feldman has authored numerous articles and led workshops on topics such as cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, helping children and adults cope with stress and worry, helping people change, and developing grit and self-control. She is a fellow and supervisor in rational emotive behavior therapy, a type of cognitive behavioral therapy. Karina Lubowitz is a trained positive discipline parent educator and a certified integrative health coach. She teaches the tools and techniques of positive discipline and supports parents on the path of positive parenting. She runs group workshops and also offers one-on-one coaching for individual support. It is her hope that when parents cultivate the skills of positive discipline through experiential learning and practice, it will create more peace in the home. Her ultimate goal is to be a guide to parents in developing skills to foster healthy, lifelong relationships with their children. In addition, Karina has a master's degree in speech and language pathology and has certifications in positive psychology and yoga and mindfulness for kids. She lives in Harrison with her husband, 3 children, and their dog Lucky. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Caren Baruch-Feldman and Karina Lubowitz. Thank you.
So hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for coming out tonight for the book launch for the Resilience Workbook for Kids. So tonight we're going to be talking about this great new book. The pages are filled with so many skill building ideas, practical tools and strategies for building resilience in ourselves and the young people in our lives. We hear this word resilience so often, especially right now, as for many, it has been a particularly difficult few years, challenging few years. So maybe we should start there with what exactly is resilience. There are many definitions of resilience, and I imagine that many of you have your own ideas of what resilience means to you. So Dr. Feldman, how would you define resilience?
So, I mean, some of you may think that resilience is coming out when there's like a tornado warning, right? Or that might be also maybe a little bit of grit. But in terms of, as you said, there's a lot of different definitions, but it's the ability to cope with stress. It's seen as a process so that when you start to do things that are challenging and then you cope with it, it builds, again, this resilience, which allows you then to cope further with other difficult or challenging things. So again, in terms of agreement, most people would say is that ability to cope with either like what we say in the book sometimes, little oops, like things like, you know, you don't get to indoor recess when you want it to be outdoor recess, or bigger things like, you know, divorce or things that are happening in, you know, serious things in the weather or even more than that.
So I don't have the book with me here, but in the back, there's also the Grit Guide for Teens, which Dr. Feldman also wrote. Can you share with the audience how resilience is different from grit?
Yeah, so people ask me that a lot because, you know, as I said, writing one book and then writing the other. So grit is been made famous by Dr. Angela Duckworth at University of Pennsylvania. And I really use her definition, and she defines grit as having passion and perseverance for long-term goals. So it's like really connecting to things and being able to stick with it. That's being gritty. Often you think about it like being able to run a marathon. You need a lot of grit because it's a long-term thing and you really need to connect with that. And resilience, as I mentioned before, is that it's like dealing with that stress. So when you're gritty, there may not be that stress component, but in terms of resilience, it's always talking about how you're managing stress. And in difficult times, you often need both.
Right. They can sort of go
Right,
hand in hand. They're
yeah.
two skills that can work side by side. So there are a lot of books out there today in the space of resilience, geared towards youth and adults alike. So why did you feel like it was important to write the Resilience Workbook for Kids today?
So I think that there are a lot of books actually for parents or for educators or even professionals about resilience. But I think what is unique about the book that actually I co-wrote with Rebecca Comizio is that the book actually is written for kids. So and some of the people actually, Dr. Robert Brooks, who's from affiliated with Harvard, and Ken Ginsberg, who is a very big resilience researcher, they were really excited and pleased that we had this book because it does fill this niche, because there's not very much out there for kids themselves to learn how to build those skills. So yes, as a parent, if you wanted to learn what to do, or as a psychologist, there were, but not so much for the kids themselves. And then in just today, also, I think it's probably very obvious, but with everything's going on with COVID, we actually started writing this book when, I don't know, in terms of people know about the experience about writing a book, but it's a long process and you need, again, a lot of grit to write a book. And so we started this, at the beginning, we actually started around when COVID started. And I thought, oh, for sure, COVID is going to be in the back window. Nobody's going to be talking about it when this book finally comes out, because I knew then how long it's going to take for it to come out. But I actually think that the timing was really very, very good, unfortunately, for the way things turned out. So I thought that it was really just so important in terms of timing. And then my also hope is that, and again, we hear a lot about things that are going on with teenagers and with college students and even just difficult things in the news about young people. And my hope is that if we work early with kids, if we get in early and work with the little ones and build these resilience skills, then those kids are going to be in a much better place when they're older, because again, in terms of world events and also in terms of mental health crisis that's going on, especially we're hearing over and over again, especially with our teens and college students. And again, as someone who works in elementary school, I mean, in their own ways, the little kids are also really struggling. So I thought it was just so important.
So I just want to clarify, though, in terms of the audience of the book. So it is intended for kids to use on their own?
So yes, the book is sort of marketed from ages 7 to 12. I would say definitely with the little ones, like the 7, 8, 9-year-olds, I think they would have to do it together with a parent or an educator or a school psychologist. I don't think it's something that's really they could just pick up and do, just in terms of maybe the language. I think the older ones they can, but and I know we're going to get there, but one of the number one factor, and I hope one thing that you come out with today in terms of building resilience that's found over and over again in the research, is having a special adult in your life. The kids who had terrible things happen to them, and they've looked at this in terms of longitudinal studies, and they've done this in America, they've done it in other countries, the ones who wind up coming out the best are the ones who have somebody special in their life. And it doesn't have to be a parent. It just has to be somebody who is what we call this charismatic adult, a person where a child can gain strength. So, so my hope is that even young kids will do this with their charismatic adult, with a person that cares about them, and it'll be that kind of experience.
So meant to be done together, sort of. Although there is someone in the audience, I won't call the person out by name, whose child is doing the book by themselves. So kids actually do that. So if you could write the grit guide for teens today, because that's the other book that Dr. Feldman wrote a few years back now, is there anything you would change, or would you add anything to that in light of, what year did that book come out? I can't.
So it came out in 2017.
Okay.
So it's pre-COVID. I don't know if we're people going to say things before COVID or after COVID. So I think that in a way, as I said, just, whenever you write something, you could probably write an addendum after you write something, Right. So I do think that one thing that maybe I would emphasize a little bit more, and I think that I do emphasize it more in this, is that, and it's also a little bit of a criticism of both grit and resilience, is that I don't like the idea of just saying this is an individual problem. I think that in order to really build both grit and resilience, we need to look at the environment. We need to look at the structure. We need to look at the society and all those things, and not just sometimes, as I said, in terms of criticism, people will say, are you saying to the most needy kids, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, just develop these skills. And so my goal, and again, in terms of writing this, Rebecca, we're never saying that it's just if you have stress, we're just going to, only ask you to sort of change and modify. I think we really need to look at the things that are surrounding and community and those structures if we really want to make real change.
Mm-hmm. I want to highlight here, if you do purchase this book, there is an online section of tools. I really wanted to highlight that for everyone. If you do purchase the book, there's instruction to download a whole set of online tools for parents and professionals. And the title there is for adults, and it's meant to be done before introducing this book to children. It's a tremendous resource, that part of the book, for parents and professionals. So you said, I guess I'm going to ask you anyway. So the Resilience Workbook, it's for kids, but why do you start with adults in the book?
Right.
So I think you spoke to that a little bit just now, but maybe if you want
Oh,
to
yeah.
just add to that why you start with the adults.
So, right. So the way that, first of all, this is something that I don't know that many people know, but when we first wrote this book, we actually wanted this parent section to be in the book. But if you've never written a book, the publisher is very, very strict with the word count. And there was no way that I could put the parent section in this book.
There are many words in this resource for parents and
Yes.
professionals. It's excellent.
Yeah, so
I
that
get it.
originally was, my hope was going to be in the book, but in the end, I think it worked out well because it's almost like two separate books. So we wrote the parent section because we do believe that parents need to, build their own resilience first. And we wanted, so in the parent section, there's two parts of it. One is just really talking to the adults, like, how do I build my own resilience? Because if your cup is not full, you're not going to be able to give to anybody else. And then what can a parent do in terms of building resilience? Also, as somebody who works in the school, I thought it was really important to talk about educators. Like, what can educators, as people who have children, your kids spend so much time in school, and it's really important that we should, as educators, try to, I've always been, and I think, Karina, this is part of our interest in knowing each other, is that I believe that, like, a lot of times when you ask parents what they want for their kids, people don't, like, if you say, what do you want your kid? You don't say, you want them necessarily only to read and write and do math. You want them to be a good person. You want them to be kind. You want them to be a good citizen. And I do think that school is a place where we learn all those skills. So I feel like as educators, I think it's really important. How do we get those lessons into school? How do we build resilience and be social emotional learning in our class? So there's an educator section. And then, as I said, the number one factor in terms of building resilience is the adult part of this. And so I thought that we needed to be really explicit and talk about how to build those skills.
Well, as I've learned, from you, it's that modeling that's so critical. So if the parents and the educators and any professionals working with children, if they themselves are practicing the skills of resilience, they're modeling, and people often do more of what others do than what they say. So that's such an important part of this book, and I cannot recommend that part of the book enough, those online resources. So if you get the book, definitely download those.
And I don't know if you were the one, I think it was you that said this to me, is that even though the book is written for kids, a lot of the concepts actually can be applied to adults. And that was the same thing when I wrote Grit Guide for Teens. So yes, I wrote it for teens, and I actually, made sure especially for Grit Guide for Teens, when you work with teens, they're very, they're a much more challenging audience than little kids. Little kids, you can come in and you could be exciting and they're interested in listening to you. But anyone who has teens knows that sometimes, but both of books are really, even though they're written for those audiences, a lot of those ideas can really apply to adults as well.
I would even say all of them, and it reads so easily because it really is made. The book is for children, and the Grit Guide is for teens, but so it may be a lower level of reading, but the concepts are universal. So I personally have been really thoroughly enjoying reading it because it's just so easy to process and understand and then implement, because these really are, ideas and tools and strategies. And so if you can digest them so easily because they're written at a level for kids, they're so much more accessible, I think, to everyone. So I love the book for that reason, and for many other reasons, but that's one of the reasons why I love the book. So in that, I'm going to reiterate something that Dr. Feldman shared a little while ago, because I do think it's so important. In that online section, there's an activity where readers learn how to support building resilience in the young people in their lives by becoming what you called a charismatic adult. Can you just talk a little bit more about what that means, becoming a charismatic adult? And then also share what you think are some of the other basic components of nurturing resilience in young people. So just to start
Yeah.
first with, what does that mean to
Right.
really become that charismatic
So the word
adult?
charismatic adult, in some ways, I don't love the term. I didn't make up the term. Actually, Julius Siegel, the psychologist, is the person who coined the term. And then Robert Brooks, the person who wrote the board, is a person who talks about it a lot as well. But charismatic adult, in terms of their definition, is somebody who a child gains strength with. In some ways, I feel like it's almost like the child almost is able to gain charisma themselves through that strength. That's like a little bit my interpretation. And as I said, that's what's been found over and over again in the research in terms of what's the number one factor in building resilience. The other thing I want to mention, and I think that sometimes, especially with COVID and other things going on in the world, we lose sight of. The good news is that children are resilient. So most kids, even kids who've gone through real, tragedies and really hardships, most of them come out resilient. And so my hope is for the ones, again, as a psychologist, I often are dealing with the kids who maybe are more fragile or who aren't resilient. So for me, it was important to learn what's going to be important to help those kids. But, and then the other thing is that no matter what, even if a child isn't going through something, all of us who are old enough to live through our lives knows that there are going to be stress. And I think it's so important for us to figure out and teach young people early, even maybe before that they have to deal with that stress, what's going to be really helpful in dealing with that. What are going to be strategies? What are going to be skills I can use? Just like I learned strategies and skills to learn reading, why can't I learn strategies and skills to deal with stress? Something that we all have to face.
So, I building muscles, the skills, like if we work on our muscles, it all goes together, it's like repetitions for your mental well-being, working on these skills so that when you're faced with them, you're strong enough. So,
and I think intuitively, we all think, yes, obviously, if somebody is struggling with reading, we would teach them as those skills. And I think, but sometimes intuitively, we don't think about like coping with stress as something that is a skill. And that's, again, like the framework that I think about these things, like how do we break these down into little pieces and then build them up so that it is a skill just like anything else. And just like any other skill, like with reading, some kids are more naturally resilient than others. There is a genetic component to this. But again, just like if you were looking at reading, what we do when we have a kid who has a challenge with reading, we look at what good readers do, and then we teach them those skills, just like good readers do.
Right. So, I don't know if you answered this already. Maybe you sort of did, but just like with resilience, what are some of the essential components for building grit with teens? Like, is it different than resilience? In order to, how would you say, what are the essential components of building grit in teens?
So I would say grit with teens is a lot about, so grit is those two parts of it. It's having passion and perseverance. I think sometimes, a lot of times people don't remember the passion part, like the kids will want their kids or teens to be gritty about things, and then they'll be like, why aren't they gritty about things? One thing that I liked about grit, and that I came across in some of Angela Duckworth's work, is she sometimes talks about the formula for grit. And I think if you're thinking about your own teens and you're like, oh, why aren't they gritty with their homework or their social life or whatever domain you're thinking about, it's important to think of this formula. So one is the thing that you're interested in your child or your teen to be gritty about, is it important to them? So in order to be gritty, you have to think that it's important. You have to think that your chance of achieving it is good. Like, you have to feel like the likelihood of your success is good, and the costs are not tremendous. So often if you think about things, let's say, for example, like I had a patient once who was very gritty in terms of their homework, but not in terms of like their social, like they were very socially anxious. So in terms of their homework, they thought homework was really important. They were getting good grades, so they knew that their likelihood of success was really high, and the cost didn't seem high to them. They liked schoolwork. However, let's say in terms of social anxiety, they felt in terms of the social anxiety, it was important. They wanted to be more social. However, the cost felt very high to them. They were so nervous putting themselves out there. It felt prohibitive to do that. And so their likelihood of success, and also they weren't that successful yet. So their likelihood of success wasn't high as well. So in that instance, when I was like working with someone, what I would try to do is make small bitty goals so that they felt more successful, and success would breed success. And that also, it felt like such a small reach to do the thing so that the cost didn't seem so prohibitive. So again, when you're thinking about grit, I think that formula sort of can be really helpful in terms of figuring, okay, so why is my team not being gritty? What part of this formula is not working for them? And how do I adjust that?
So it's interesting, but what about the passion piece?
So passion is the important.
Right,
Right.
so it's, how do you make it important? If it, it's just not important to them, I guess you do the other pieces, and then with the success.
Well, but remember, it has to be there,
Right.
especially with
So
your
can you
team.
not get gritty with things that are not important
Well,
to you?
right, well, that's really true. Like that,
So
what
that's-
Angela would say, the reality is might think it's important,
Right.
but there must, that you're somehow, then that's the work, is to make your team think that this is important. Let's say,
Right.
for example, they don't think schoolwork is important. That's the work, is to figure out how to have that connection to it. Why is, maybe they don't like schoolwork, but they like, let's say, doing something like in the future. You have to make that connection. Like you have to say, well, if you want to work in the music field, then you have to graduate from high school. Like, do you know what I'm saying? So that you have to
So you
make
can
it
highlight that sort of
Yes.
for them
right,
to bring that purpose sort of
right,
to help them get gritty.
right. But
that's
without that,
interesting.
yeah, you can't get there.
Right, interesting. Now that we know about your books, about grit and resilience, would you like to share with the audience a story about how you experienced grit and resilience in your own life?
Yes. So some of you may know this story, but so like I'd say, so I wrote the Grit Guide for Teens, and I actually in 2017 was the same year that I wrote the book. I also did the New York Marathon, which was like a big accomplishment for me, and also was just like a banner year for me. I actually got nominated to be like school psychologist in this area of like the year, and just things were really, I felt very happy in terms of my family and everything like that. And then in shortly afterwards, I started not to feel well. I was just feeling sick all the time, and I was going from doctor to doctor, and I could not figure out what was going on with me. And I ultimately found out that I had a growth on my pituitary, and it was causing cortisol to be emitted, and it was literally causing me to have stress. I had to get surgery, and it was a huge recovery. And even now with the recovery, I still sometimes get a little bit of headaches, and it's just, thank God, like the cortisol is not happening anymore, but I really had firsthand what it feels like to go through like stress, and how stress feels like literally in your body. And so I felt very connected to this topic. And I felt again, you often write about what we know. And so I felt like it was really important, given my experience and what I went through and what were some of the things that were really helpful for me. I wanted to sort of share that as it applies to children. So
what was one thing you would say that was helpful to you that you applied? If you could,
So,
not to put you on the spot, but
no. So one thing that I felt was really helpful is something based on Kristen Neff's work. It's called Self-Compassion. It's called the Self-Compassion Break. And what it has a few parts to it, but basically it's a mindfulness practice. And what it says, the first part of the practice is to say that you are having a moment of suffering. So it's acknowledging that you're suffering, because I think sometimes when we're suffering, we just want to deny it, or we want to brush it off, or we don't want to sort of acknowledge, yes, I am suffering right now. And again, when I was feeling sick, I felt like that was very helpful, just to say, I'm having a moment. It's a moment, not a lifetime, but I'm having a moment of suffering. And then the second part of the meditation is to say that to be human is to suffer. Because a lot of times when these things are happening, we feel very alone. We feel like we're the only people that are going through these things. And it connects us to the fact that nobody has a free pass in life. Everybody has moments that they're suffering. And so to connect to our humanness, that this is what's happening. And then the third part is that we want to be compassionate with ourselves. So often when we're having a hard time, we often are like, why is this happening to me? When's it going to be over? Why can't I do things for me? Like, I have a lot of energy. You can ask my husband, he's sitting over there. And for me, not being able to do things and be on my game was really, really challenging. And I was very hard on myself. So it's, you put your hand on your heart and you basically say, like, let me be compassionate with myself. Let's not have judgment about this. And sort of to be able to sort of breathe that in. So that self-compassion break that I described, I felt was really important. It's something that I actually share in the book with the adults. And then also when we were writing this, again, I told you they're very picky with the word count. We ran out of room in terms of all the activities we can. So we have this bonus activity.
Yes,
That's
bonus
also,
section.
yeah, it's a bonus section of
yes.
activities for the kids. And it's also in the
Oh, so
bonus
that
activities.
piece of the self-compassion is in there.
Yes, for the kids. And then
Okay,
it's also there for the adults too.
okay. I love that part. Kristen Neff does great work. So if anyone else does not know her work, she's excellent with self-compassion. So that's a very important piece, you're saying, to resilience, in building basically resilience, to have compassion when you're in those moments where you're down,
Yes.
right? So that's a,
And in terms of like just the way I frame the book, so we have like in terms of just the general framework of the book, I have a lot of acronyms, but one of the big one is STORMS. So that it's S, it starts with adults. So I very clear feels like, in order to build resilience in kids, you have to start with yourself in terms of building your own resilience, and also start with you in terms of helping your youngster. And then T is that you need to teach yourself the skills of resilience. Like, and again, to see it as a skill and to learn these things that I'm going to say a little bit more about. And then O, to own all your emotions. So again, a lot of times, I think that a lot of times today in society, there's like a lot of toxic positivity and everything's like looking for the silver lining. And there is value in being more optimistic, and, resilience is related a lot to optimism. However, it's really also important to like accept the yuck, to know that, like we said in the self-compassion, like I'm having a moment of suffering, to acknowledge that this is a hard time. I remember when my son, he was actually studying abroad when COVID hit, and he had to come home early. I mean, he stayed a little longer than he probably could. Finally, I don't know if you remember, Trump got on the TV and he's like, basically, if you don't come home, we don't know if we're going to let anybody in. And at that point, I was like, you need to leave. Like, you've got to leave Italy. Where was he, in Italy at that point? I don't know. He said probably some other place in the world. Yeah. So he really did. Czech Republic, and finally he had to come home. It was very disappointing. I don't know if people when they do this, gap semester, it's, something he was really looking forward to. And I remember saying to him, like, it's just upsetting. It's really like, there's, it's upsetting. I know, like, this is upsetting. And again, part of me just wants to be like, you did get to go to Switzerland, and you did go, but I knew that wasn't the place.
that's the toxic positivity.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
got it, yep.
And to sort of accept the yuck. And then also, though, that there is value about pumping up the positive, that we as a human being, we have a tendency to focus on the negative. That's how we're wired. But to learn to have those even micro moments of positive emotions are really, really good too. I actually, in the summer at Harrison, it's a little advertisement if you have seen the enrichment calendars, but we do a happiness boot camp, and we do it for 3rd through 6th grade. And so Jen Spagnola, some of you know who she is. She's the assistant principal at Harrison Avenue. We did something really like fun with her. We set up these boxes, and we had these tables, and the tables were like next to each other, and there were tablecloths on there. And then there were boxes, like 6 boxes across. And in one box that was sort of like between the 2 tables, actually there was a student hiding underneath the box. And what happened was, I said to Jen Spagnola, I said to her, okay, this is what you need to do. And all the kids knew what was going to happen. I said, all you need to do is you pick up the box and you just have to say what's under the box. So it had water, pen, whatever. And so she's very competitive, by the way, Jen Speckle. I didn't know this about her. She's running from one side to the other. She's like, pen, water, watch. And then all of a sudden she picks up the box and some kid pops up on her face and everyone starts to laugh. And again, I was like, it was contagious. And I was trying to show the kids like the power of joy and laughter and how that can be really helpful. So as I said, kind of going back to the book. So O is like about owning all those emotions, both the uncomfortable and the comfortable. And then R is to rule your mind. Like, how can you think about things in a way that's going to make you feel more optimistic, and to kind of like to get you through those hard times. Because again, optimism is associated with resilience. And then it's really nice to have these skills, but if you don't put them into practice, if you don't manage the behavior and then put it into behavior, then it really doesn't only go so far. And then the last S is that it's about support. It's about that structure. It's about that environment that's really huge. So that's the way I sort of organize the book. It's each chapter is one of those areas.
Of storms.
Yes, of storms.
Yeah. I want to make sure that everybody here leaves knowing how to get the books.
Yes.
So how can people get both of the books? The Resilience Workbook for Kids and the Grit Guide for Teens.
Well, I would hope that they would actually, we have somebody from Pleasantville here. I think it's great to support your local bookstore. So we have someone in the back in terms of selling the books. They're also available wherever books are sold. But I would like it if people are interested, and I will sign and, you know, give a signature if people purchase the books here today.
So we covered so much already in our time together. Are there any last thoughts that you have, big overarching ideas, takeaways that you want to share? You shared so many already, but any big idea that you would like people to take away with them?
I think as I said, I would love people to walk away today with that understanding that they can really make a difference in a child's life. It doesn't have to be even such a big moment. A lot of times that's how I sort of think of my work, especially in the school, that I'm like hopefully going to make a difference in a child's life. And I think this is a skill that we can strengthen in our youth. And I think that we need to. I think that these are really challenging times. And I think though with the right tools, we could really help our kids. And that's really my hope in writing this book, is to ultimately help the kids who are struggling now. And then if kids aren't, having some stress right now, to have those skills so that when they have that moment of suffering, like we all will,
Right.
they'll know what to do.
Right. So it's like it can be
preventative, yeah.
Right, preventative as well. Yeah. So does anybody, I want to open it up. Does anybody have, to the audience, if anybody has any questions or comments for Dr. Feldman?
I'm always yelling at my 6.5-year-old, just chill out, stop freaking out of that. I'm always the one who freaks out. And I'm glad there's a sec, she just gets it from me, and my aunt has even told me that I'm just high energy. So my daughter is, of course. And, I'm just glad there's a teaching section about how we can show resilience and not overact in an instance.
Right. So partly there's a little bit of, physics going on here. We're sort of wired. There's this thing called mirror neurons. So when our child are sort of freaking out, we sort of pick up that energy. It's almost like, you ever see like a tennis ball, when you hit it as a lob, then it comes back as a lob. It's the same thing. It's like when your child is having a tantrum, everything in you wants to have a tantrum sort of back. So I think you have to kind of remember that, like as the adult, okay, this is what they're giving to me, and it is kind of hard. Everything in me is going to sort of want to give back that same energy, but I'm the big one, right? So it's often like you have to kind of take a step back. And one of the more powerful things we can do, and again, it's found in the research, is co-regulation. So when you are able to sort of calm down, then your child can also calm down. And again, and I know Amy Price is here, and she's a school psychologist with me at Harrison. And part of the things a lot of times in my school, what I do when a lot of times they'll call me, I'll be like, on the loudspeaker, they'll be calling me to come down to the gym, to outside. And I don't have like a fair, some wand or something, right? But what I do have is that remembrance about my energy. And even though they want me to run literally down, and sometimes I wear heels so that like I literally can't run, because like I'm like, if I wear heels today, it won't be a running day, right? But I go down slowly, and I often, like, more and more, I'm finding it's so important for me literally to sit under the tree, sit on the grass, sit on the floor, but wherever that kid is, so I'm low and my energy is really also soft and low. And in your presence and when you're calm like that, just like that negative energy is contagious, that calm energy is also contagious. And that can be so helpful and more powerful than any of the words that you can even say.
And that's so hard to do in the moment when I had to share that
Yes.
when our kids are, having their moments, it's so hard to do.
Yeah. And she's like at 11 and I'm still at 5. I'm just like, I'll never go down. And then I like.
Right,
just
and you
keep- I
really
can't get up
can't,
that-
you can't in that, like, so sometimes it's almost like, I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit too, like she's up here, you're down there, and it's in the moment, so I don't know.
And like, we're fine. Like, she's 6 and a half, so she's
Yeah.
happy. She's fine. I just feel like as a teenager, this is really gonna get bad. You know what I mean? Like, she's fine. She's happy. She's good. She's just,
Right.
it's scary, but just, in the later years.
Right, but I think that like that's my big thing. I feel like if you can figure out how to do this in the younger ages, I think that this can really be helpful.
And it's a
But I think
practice.
sometimes,
It's
and
a
it said, I think sometimes it's also okay to put a pause. Like sometimes you need to like take a step back. Like everything in our being wants to take a step forward, but sometimes what's really more helpful is to take a step back and even to take a pause. And that's okay. Nobody, they're not, your child's going to be there and you can kind of revisit this. But I think that sometimes, and I think again, like as a psychologist, I have like learned this more and more, and it's really hard because let's say somebody, like a lot of times when your kid or someone in school does something pretty egregious, you want to address it there and then. You're like, you just said that to the teacher, like the teacher or me or somebody wants, you cannot talk to the teacher like that. But already when that kid is off, and they're really what we have, what we call an amygdala hijack, nothing good is going to come out of that conversation then. And so it's really important to take that step back.
And come back.
Yes,
Take a
and
step
come
back and
back.
come back.
Right.
When you
Right.
are,
But timing is
Right.
really essential.
right, that's right.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you, as a professional, know when a child or like a teen or even an adult's stress is just like sort of normal, everyday, mundane stress, or if the stress is like more serious, needs like much more attention or care? I mean, it's sort of related to the book, but it's not exactly the book. I'm just curious to know, like, are there certain signals that you're looking for, the certain measurements you're looking for? Like if a child gets teased and comes to you and this child's been teased or whatever, how do you know when like that stress should be like, oh, don't worry about it. It's just, they're just teasing your hair. They're calling you a princess, whatever it is. Or maybe the child's stress is like much more serious than that, and like it really needs to be attended. So I'm just curious to know, like, as a professional, what are the things you look for and you measure this kind of stuff?
Well, there's a section, actually, I talk a little bit about good stress, workable stress, and toxic stress. So good, there is such a thing as good stress. Like when you get stressed because you have a big exam coming up, right? Like that stress that like motivates you to study, that's like a good stress. Like it wouldn't be really good if you didn't, have that, right? So there's parts of stress that's really very, very helpful. There's workable stress. I would say the teasing of the hair, or some kid calls some other kid like tuba or something like that, or like something nonsense. That's what I call workable stress. It's stress, definitely, but sometimes, or if you don't get picked for a team, or or like you don't get a solo in the concert. These are things that are, happening right now in school that we're facing. That's what I would call workable stress.
Yeah.
They're disappointments, but actually by going through them, you grow
And build resilience.
and build resilience.
Right.
So it's like, actually, it's like, that's the byproduct. In order to have resilience, you actually need a little bit of stress. And I think that sometimes what happens in that situation is, and I hope I'm not insulting anybody, because I sometimes can do this as well, parents often step in. They're like, that is not okay, but that nobody can like call my kid, some princess. And they step in and they don't often let their kid figure that out or manage it. And I think that kind of stress is really important. I just recently, my daughter actually, she wants to be a psychologist, which is really exciting. And she went to her advisor at school and she wanted to find out about like what classes that she needed to take. And instead of her advisor just telling her about classes, her advisor just told her she shouldn't be a psychologist. I don't know why you want to be a psychologist. There's going to be the psychologists. There's going to be all mental health workers. There's not going to be psychologists anymore. And what did I want to do? What do you think I wanted to do? I want to pick up the phone and like find out who this advisor was and why she's talking to my daughter like this, right? And then I need to stop and then be like, okay, she's in college. Like, I can't like get involved with this. Like, this is stressful. I didn't like it, stressed her out, but this is also something she needs to manage. And then there's things like what we were saying, like when you have to step in or when you know it's problematic, when it's toxic stress, when it's toxic stress is defined as stress that's unrelenting, and also without any support. Support is like the kryptonite to stress. It breaks it up. So when kids or when adults have stress, but there's nowhere out, it's just not stopping, and they have no one to help them, then that's toxic stress. And then, people need to step in. And just in general, in terms of your question, I guess like in my mind, when, should parents or schools be concerned in terms of stress, is that when there's like a real change in functioning, when your child's not going to school, when you know what I'm saying, where there's real impact like that, then that's times to obviously, really step in.
Thank you.
So, you get to call people.
The two words resilience and grit are, ubiquitous in the sense of it being important in all of our lives. And when you were describing the grit guide, I think of grit as something less teachable than resilience. I think grit, and maybe I'm saying it as a parent who has decided herself whether their child has grit. And when you talk about strategies in becoming resilient, I'd be curious, besides the compassion rate, but just another example of a strategy or a tool to become or learn resilience, and how, or if there are tools to become gritty. I feel like gritty is more innate and organic, and it's hard to teach grit and passion. I think that that's something that's sort of unteachable or more unwavering. Would you disagree with that? Can you teach grit? And
Yes,
you can.
Yeah. So I would think that both things are genetic.
Mhm.
They're both, like, I mean, like if you probably saw like how much percent of these things, there's a large part that's genetic. So yes, there are probably, you have probably in your own families, you probably think of your own kids, probably some are more resilient, some of them are more gritty than others. However, I think both are teachable. I think and again, I feel like the way to teach them is to break them down to skills and to focus on mindset, behavior, and then that support aspect. But I definitely think that you can teach both. But I do think that grit has to be, the child has to want it. And the way that I wrote the grit guide for teens is that I have it by different domains. So we all are, so the other thing is that when we talk about grit, it's not just a global thing. Often, if you look at our own lives or our kids' lives, they're gritty in certain aspects, but not gritty in others, right? Well, we'll have some kid, we can have a teenager who's super gritty about sports, right? They'll do everything for their team, but they might not be that gritty about their schoolwork, right? So I think that the way to address that is to look at that strength and say, why are you're very gritty in terms of like, you show up and you do all these things for your team. What is it about that? How can we look at that and learn from that and then apply it to the area that, may be important? But I think that, again, part of the problem is that we need to help our youngsters connect to it and see why it's important to them, especially as a teenager. It can't just be important to you, right?
It might not be important.
It might not be. And then that's not what grit is about. Because grit, by definition, has to be that the person has to connect to it. It has to be something important to them.
Right.
Building on what she said, because I was thinking a lot about that too. Do you think it's possible for a child and young adult into an adult to be an adaptable, successful, resilient person without any grit?
So you're saying, can you be
You develop
resilient?
into a resilient adult and a successful adult and a kind adult and just an overall adaptable human being without ever developing grit? Because I'm hearing what the woman behind me is saying, and I work with kids myself, and I often see that there's a very high expectation in this 2022 for kids to be gritty, and I feel like people use the word gritty like they use the word kind now, like just be gritty, or I want you to be gritty, or she's so gritty, and they really, I feel like what you're saying is gritty is really based on passion. And I find that many children, certainly young children,
are they really so passionate at such a young age? And is it possible to grow into a resilient young adult and adult without any grit?
Well,
Or ever
yeah.
developing grit?
I think that it's true. I think that like, that's why I do emphasize, and as I said, I think that if Angela Duckworth was sitting here and who's really like one of the people who talked about it, I think that she would also complain that people forget about the two parts of her definition, that part of it is that passion. So I think that is important. And I'm not saying that, like, let's say for you as a parent, you think academics are important and your child doesn't. You can't be like, okay, well, I guess they don't think it's important, so we're just, forget about them being gritty. I think there's ways to then motivate them, to find out where they are and then to help motivate them to the next level. But I think that part has to happen, that you have to make it important. And I think that sometimes to be resilient, it is to do hard things. I think to cope with stress, it's not difficult. So I think sometimes that using the term of gritty means that it's a person who is invested. But I mean, as a psychologist, I get lots of kids. I get some kids who are not gritty at all, and then I have some that aren't. And then my job is then to help them to move them on that pendulum. I think sometimes, like also as a psychologist, as patients, you get a patient sometimes like totally ready to work, and then you have a patient who comes in who's basically got pulled by their parent and they don't think they have any problems. And then my job is to start where they are and to help make like those small changes. And for them first to recognize that there's an issue. Because I think that's, you have to meet people where they are.
Is there like any specific reason why you chose to write the Resilience book for kids and the Grit Guide for teens? Like, is there a specific like benefit to addressing resilience before grit?
No. So what happens is, and that actually I was speaking, I did a school psychology podcast and we were talking about writing books. And so what happened was when I have a website and a blog, and so I would, blog about things and send out newsletters. And then the publisher came and they saw my blog and they approached me and they said, are you interested in writing a book about grit? So Angela Duckworth at the time, this is 2017 when the book was released, but like back in 2015, she had done this, big TED Talk that was a huge splash. And so when you write your first book and the publisher says, would you like to write a book about grit, for teens? You say, okay, yes. So basically when the publisher approached me, that's what I wrote about. And for me, it was interesting because there wasn't a lot written because she was the one who sort of put this on the map and it was really all her research. So I had to start like researching everything that she did and all of the other research. So that's why I wrote that book about teens. And I think it was really good to write it for teens because I think, although as I said to you, for me, it's kind of a tricky audience because I feel like if it doesn't feel like it, like if the wording or the examples are off, I think that a lot of times teens are like, this is stupid or whatever. So that's why I wrote that book first. And then what happened was because I wrote that book and the book was actually really successful, it's been translated into 3 different languages. So then when I wanted to, I again, writing a book is a lot of work. Okay. So I only write something that I feel like is really important. And then I was really interested in this topic of resilience because of my own experience. Like, yes, like grit was important, but for me personally, when I got sick, I needed to like lean into resilience. Like I couldn't just be gritty. It wasn't going to work. So then I went back to the publisher and I'm like, okay, I would like to now write a book about resilience. I'd like to do it for children. And they're like, okay, you can do that. So that was how that happened, that it was in that order.
I have a question from the chat.
Mhm.
Sorry to
Oh,
interrupt.
yeah.
Do you have guidance on how much a parent should guide a child through your resilience book? Would it be beneficial for them to work through some of it themselves?
So we talked about that a little bit. Like, as I said, I think for younger kids, definitely, I see it being done, the book together side by side with an adult. I think it also depends on the child. I think, again, for me, part of almost the way I put this book together was with this notion that this charismatic adult is so important. There's also in the book what we call bonus sections. And in the bonus section is an activity to do with your special adult. So the way the book is written is sort of almost nurturing it. The other thing that's sort of like fun about the book is that each chapter ends with a puzzle. And the puzzles are hard, by the way, like when Rebecca and I were like doing these puzzles, I'm like, these are hard. And we even say like, don't forget, you may need to use resilience to do the puzzles. But also like even just doing the puzzles builds resilience. They're not easy, they're stressful, like not terribly stressful, they're workable stress, right? But we want kids to feel like, okay, I can feel uncomfortable, I'm not gonna crumble, and it's okay. I think that for a lot of the kids, and I'm sure that Amy would probably agree about this, we see today, like a lot of kids are very crumbling, like things happen, things don't work out, you're not picked for a team, or as I said, there's indoor recess when you wanted to be outdoor recess, and it feels catastrophic. And so I think that I really like kids to learn that they can feel something uncomfortable and they're also going to be okay. So.
Can I just ask something? My husband is the one that
Yeah.
asked that other question, so I just wanted to ask, maybe you answered this already, but when you're in that space of stress that you said is the kind of stress that's, I think you said workable, and you talk about this charismatic adult or support, do you have any go-to, like even, for example, the stress that you had in the experience with your daughter, let's say with the psychology, with the guidance counselor, and you wanted to go to that guidance and, you know, basically give them a piece of your mind based on your experience, but just what can you do when you are the supportive adult in that child's life? Like, what is something that you can say or do that would be appropriate so that you're not jumping in there and doing what you shouldn't be doing to help to basically be that model of resilience? Because when they are struggling there, and we talked about the adults, working with the adults first,
Right.
and being a model of what you want to see, what can you show them in you in those situations that's still letting them build their resilience and you're not jumping in to rescue, basically?
Right. So I think that listening and not necessarily jumping into problem solving can be really important. And again, I think we as parents, and I'll be first to admit that I can do this as well, we don't like when our kids are suffering. We want to like quickly solve the problem. But I think helping them and sorting out their feelings and letting them, like, again, Mark Brackett is a big researcher from Yale, and he talks a lot about feelings. That's also a chapter or part of the book that I'm very proud about. Like, again, a lot of these books, they don't spend so much about feelings. A lot of our book, we talk about that, but just literally labeling your feelings, talking about your feelings, getting really descriptive. Like, again, in my groups, we'll spend a lot of time in talking about, you know, tell us a time you felt happy, we throw a ball and it says happy, tell us a time when you're excited. Just getting kids more familiar with feeling words and being able to talk about those feelings and express them, and then having them kind of problem solve and think through. You know, again, I want kids, it's great to have support. As I said, support is huge, but I think ultimately we want our kids to feel like they have the resources within themselves. A lot of times, you know, in my own practice, I deal with like a lot of kids who have anxiety, and, you know, often they rely very heavily on their family. And that's, again, it's helpful to have your family. But ultimately, I want kids to have that within themselves so that if they go to a play date, if they go to school, or they go anywhere, they know themselves that they can do it. And they don't always just have to rely on the parent to get fueled.
And when that happens, when that good parenting moment happens, you also watch the child you're trying to rescue fail, right? So if that instinct you just described is like the right way to do it, per se, even though it might involve the child suffering a little bit more in order to figure out how to do it themselves. And that's where the parenting decision is challenging, because we're really restraining ourselves, but knowing that that restraint is going to help the child in the long run.
Yes. And a lot of this, and that's also very true about grit and about resilience, there's always a trade-off in life between what feels good in the moment and what feels good in the long run. In the moment, sometimes it feels better to swoop in, or even for your child, for me to like go in there and like give a piece of my mind to this person at being upset, right? But in the long run, that's not going to be helpful. And again, we tend to, you know, again, this is based on a lot of like, you know, economic theory, Kahneman and Tversky's work about, you know, how we value long-term versus short-term. But we are built to value what feels good in the moment versus what's going to be good in the long term. And we have to remember that. But obviously in the long term, it's helpful to be able to sit with a little bit of suffering and know that you're not going to fall apart and be able to do that, as opposed to always trying to, like, you know, make a smooth path. A lot of the book, one of the big themes in the book is about water and sailing and boating and stuff. And a lot of the things I always say to kids is that my job is not to make your like an ocean a lake. My job is to teach you how to ride those waves. And a lot of times parents or kids, they think they're gonna come in here, I'm gonna figure out how I'm gonna make everything into a lake. And I'm like, that's not what we're gonna do here. We're gonna learn how to ride those waves. So,
It's like that idea of getting comfortable with
With
being
being
uncomfortable.
yes,
Right,
get
so that's
comfortable with
really what-
being uncomfortable.
Right.
And that's a big idea about resilience, is to get to a place where you can get to know that there's going to be bumps. And again, in terms of your question about why this is important, I think again, today's society with social media, everybody thinks that everybody's life is rainbows and unicorns, and nobody thinks that everyone else's, life is just so easy. But nobody walks around. I say this all the time and when I have sessions. Nobody's walking around with a big sign at college saying, I'm having a terrible moment or I'm suffering. But everybody has those moments. And I think it's really important for us to, to say that to our kids and to know that that's okay. It's normal.
And healthy and good.
And
It builds resilience.
Yes, and it builds resilience.
Right.
So,
So. Anybody have any more questions? Anyone in the back there?
I give up one more from the chat.
Okay.
It's very, very similar to the gentleman's question. Thank you for this amazing session. I have a 7-year-old, and how could I differentiate if my kid is stressed about a situation or just expressing that way? And that situation is not actually stressing him, and he would be okay immediately after with a snack. So I don't know if there's an age difference with, teenager versus a 7-year-old.
I'm trying to understand exactly the question. So the question is it different about how to handle this if you're dealing with a 7-year-old versus a teenager?
Yeah, so differentiating if the child is stressed about a situation or just expressing.
So that could
And
be,
he said,
it could
and
be-
it'll be a snack will make it all go away.
right. I mean, listen, I think with little kids, often distraction is something that you can do, and I think it has its place. I do think that, again, that we want to help kids, be able to process, not everything has to be processed and things like that, but I think that there's value in even teaching little kids about what they're feeling and what's going on for them and how they can resolve that. And I do think that even little kids, even 7-year-olds, are able to do that.
But probably also important to recognize that when you're 7 versus, let's say you're a teenager versus an adult, there's a threshold, and that threshold, perhaps as you're building resilience, increases for your ability to tolerate and sit with the discomfort.
Yeah.
So maybe that's sort of something that was being asked, I think, in the question. I don't know.
Yeah,
That's-
and listen, I think little kids are built differently than
Right.
they're more immature. And I think also under stress, people get more immature. So little kids, when they're very stressed, again, that goes back to your question about timing. I think that sometimes you can't have those conversations. Those conversations need to be done in a quiet moment. And sometimes maybe the answer is just to have a snack right now and to kind of come back. And there's always hangry, with little kids. I do think that when kids are sleep and hunger and all those things are big things for little kids. And if those things are out of sort, it's going to really affect them. Although I think sleep is very important for teens as well. Yes.
I just had one question that's a little bit broader than that. And every headline you read, I have 3 teenage sons, but in every headline you read and everything you do, you really feel like we're in crisis. Kids are just in crisis mode across the whole country, not just in pockets, but there's a real crisis of anxiety. And I run books, and almost every book we pick out for little kids is how to deal with anxiety. And I'm like, oh my God, why do we need all these books for 5-year-olds? And I can't think of one I read when I was 5 that told me how to deal with anxiety. And so I'm just curious from your perspective outside what each of us as individuals, what do you think communities should be doing? And is there really a crisis, or are we overblowing it from the media perspective, and are we building that crisis?
I mean, I think that there really is a crisis. As I said, I don't know, in the New York Times in the last week or so, there was, an article about these kids being stuck in emergency rooms and the number. I mean, 1 in 3 kids have an anxiety disorder. I mean, that is huge. And there's been a 60% increase in suicide attempts in teens. I mean, that's a crisis. I mean, anything else that would be increasing to that extent, we'd be, that's crazy numbers. So I think that there really is. I think it's related to COVID, but a lot of those numbers were before COVID. And, people say, what is the role of social media and how, and I think, again, one of one of the real antidotes to stress is connection. And I think one of the hardest things about COVID was like, what do we all have to do? Physical distance. And even as I said before that, you know, all of this stuff online, that's not, there's a certain level of connection, but it's not real connection. And so I think that that plays a part. And I think that we have to figure out, you know, how to kind of come together as a community. You know, at Harrison Avenue this year, we're really focusing on belonging, because I feel like that is really important. Kids need to feel a sense of home. They need to feel a sense of belonging. So, you know, and that has to be a priority before we even talk about academics. So I do think, you know, sometimes out of, I feel like now schools are, like, I've been interested in this thing about SEL for way longer than it's so popular. But I think now one of the good things that maybe came out of COVID is that now people are saying that we need to do this in schools. It's not
Social
enough.
emotional learning
Yeah,
for
social
the
emotional
audience.
learning, yes, that we need to do these things in school. So that's kind of my hope. But we are seeing it, you know, a lot. And I don't know if it's really overblown. I mean, I guess there's all, you know, people, you know, have, you know, things sometimes in the press, they have different angles. But as I said, as somebody who's worked in schools, as I said, I think like the little kids and the big kids, they're having a hard time.
And to speak to your point, you know, about all these books that you see that are out there today published, and I'm sure you could speak even more to this. You're talking about Angela Duckworth and, you know, Kristen Neff and all these, you know, what came to mind when you were just talking a little while ago was this Mona Delahook and her books. There's so much more research out there on understanding, you know, about, we're talking about grit and resilience, of how you build these skills and that they are teachable.
Right.
And so that's also why you're seeing there's so much more being written, because there's science and research out there. So it's bringing it to, you know, to people, including kids, because it is something that you can practice. I mean, this workbook is a perfect example how young kids, as young as I think you said 7, can sit and do a lot of these games that science has shown builds resilience. So it's again, a great resource, supported by all the science that's out there, that it's teachable. So it's very hopeful, you know, that there are things that we can do. Thank you.
Our last question.
All right, I'm a teenager myself. And so I know you touched on the idea about how it's like human instinct to have a negativity bias in our brain. And I know that at times, like, for example, if I get a bad test grade, like, I'm gonna think negative about it. I'm not going to be happy about it. So how do you learn to train your mind to not have this negativity bias and to be more positive about stressors, hardships that come into your life?
So I think that's a good question. I think first of all, like, the first step is to know that we all as humans have a negativity bias. And actually that worked well for us. Like, I sometimes say, like, back in the day when we all lived in caves, right? So if like a lion came in your cave, you would want to pay attention to that, right? And if, like, you know, a butterfly came in your cave, you could not really, it wouldn't matter. So we genetically have inherited all those genes of people who survived because they heeded the tiger or the bear coming into their cave. So we all have that negativity bias. But I often say to teens and to all people that it's important to become metacognitive. So like when you're having a moment when you're maybe focusing too much on that negativity, it's good to take a step back and say to yourself, okay, my body is trying to help me here. It thinks I'm back in the cave days. Well, we're not in cave days. I'm having that negative bias. And so let me like kind of put this in perspective. And a good question to ask yourself is, what would I say to a friend? If a friend was going through this and they got this test report or test, you know, back, what would I say to them? Would I say to them, I don't even know why you bothered going to college. Like, I don't know, like, why you're even applying. You're so not going to get in. Or would you say something different? Because when we think about how we would talk to our friends, we're often much more rational. There's this thing called, it's based on Ethan Cross work. He's from Michigan. I know you went to Michigan.
He's at University of Michigan.
University of Michigan. And he talked about this idea of self-distancing. When we put a little bit of space, when we think about how we talk to a friend, we are much more rational. When we talk about ourselves, we're much more emotional. And interestingly enough, if you put yourself in an MRI and you look at your brain, the amygdala lights up when we talk about ourselves, but when we talk about a friend, the hippocampus lights up. So literally, when we process things, we process it in different parts of our brain. So again, a good question to ask yourself is, what would I say to a friend and to remind yourself and almost thank the part of yourself that's saying, thank you for like trying to save me, but I got this. And, you know, to remember about that negative bias. Anyway, I know it's getting late. So I want to thank everybody. And again, if people are interested, I'm happy to autograph some books. So
Thank you so much, everyone, for
thanks,
coming.
everybody.